At this point, I'd like to introduce a little bit of interaction or animation into some of my states. So I'm going to jump back to Illustrator and get that scene opened up again. And so here I'm going to go back to some of my layers and export just the individual layer with a transparent background, and that will allow me to have an equivalent layer in P5 that I can move around either with a mouse or automatically. So I want to get maybe one or two of these seagulls, probably at least one or maybe both of the human figures. So I'm exporting this as a PNG, and that's going to allow me to use transparency for the background. And here where I get options for the background color, I'm going to set that to transparent. And I like to use the super sampling method for anti-aliasing. I'll leave this at screen resolution. That is the same resolution that I used for cropping all of my individual scenes that I did in Photoshop as an earlier step. That'll make sure that the scale matches up to the rest of my crops that I already did. I'll go ahead and hit OK. Okay, now back to P5. I'll just set up a couple more variables and upload those new files. And now I just need to figure out which scene I want these to go in. And I think it's probably this one. So that's state 3. And actually, now that I'm thinking of it, state 4 looks a little bit better. So let's look for state 4. Here we go. Let's add in that image of the boy. And I'm not sure exactly where I want this to go just yet. I can see it's kind of floating in the air there. That doesn't look quite right. Thinking I want it maybe more around here. So that is probably something like 780 because our canvas is 800 units wide and maybe 200. And of course we can do this by guessing and testing. We could go into Photoshop. That's actually looking pretty nice right there. When we're setting up a state machine like this, in a way, it's actually like having one sketch that has several different draw loops. Now, you probably know this already, but we can only have one function draw block per sketch. But with our state machine, we can sort of break that down into sub sketches that have different behaviors. So I'm adding these images together here as if this were just a draw block, and I don't really have to worry about what's going on in the rest of the blocks. And I think what I'd like to do here is to have some interaction with the mouse. So I'm going to duplicate that line, and let's see what that looks like. You'll notice every time I'm restarting the sketch, it starts at state 0. I'm working on state 4, so I'm going to go up to my declaration and initialization. Let's just initialize that at 4, so we're starting in that scene every time. So this is looking pretty good. I think that I want to maybe not have this figure floating up into the sky. So let's see if we can constrain the motion to something around this range. Let's go into our states again. Let's see, state 4. So I like what's happening with the horizontal motion. So that's what's coming from the mouse X system variable. I don't think I really want to be using the mouse Y. So let's set that back to the static value that we had programmed in earlier. So now it doesn't really matter where my mouse is vertically on the screen, but it will still follow horizontally. So that's looking pretty good. I think also I'd like to make some constraints so that I'm not running too far over to the left. So for that, we can use the map function. In this case, I think I can just set up a local variable. So I'm going to say let boy x equals, and then we'll set up the map function. Now what we're mapping is the mouse X position. And what I'd like to do is, rather than have it span all the way side to side across the canvas, I'd like to have it span from the right side to right about here. So we're going to be mapping mouse X. Its normal range is going to be 0 to whatever the width of the canvas is. And I'd like to map it to this range. We started off here at 780, and I think that looked pretty good. So 780 is going to be our max. And we want to start the constraint range at right about here. So that's roughly half. Let's call that maybe 450 pixels. So between 450 and 780. And let's see how that looks. Now, of course, nothing's set up yet because I haven't plugged in that boyx variable. And the image function is still looking at mouse x, so we need to make sure that we're setting up all of our relationships between the different kinds of information. So that's looking pretty good. I think this is going maybe a little bit too far. Let's try 750. Maybe even a little bit less. And I think I'd like to constrain a little bit farther. I maybe want that figure only to get to about here. So let's say that that's something like 550. And again, there's no real right way to do this. We could test with graph paper. We could test in Photoshop or Illustrator. At this point, I have most of the functionality of my sketch set up, so it makes sense to me to just kind of play with it in the code. And of course, I've got a lot of practice with this, so you might not find that that works so well for you, and you need to do it a different way. That's totally fine. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. I'd like to see, I think maybe in this state, in state 0, let's see if we can put that seagull in. And I think maybe I'd like it to come from side to side across the screen, just to give us a little bit of animation. Again, the main focus here is the state machine and being able to navigate between distinct sets of visuals using some sort of a navigation scheme. So we've got that set up already. I just want to give this a little bit of life, a little bit of character to go along with sort of the way that I envision the image that corresponds with this poem. So let's look at state 0. And I think it was this first one that I liked a little bit better, that gull 0. So let's try image, gull 0. And I think we'll probably start this around the same, so 750, so over towards the right-hand edge of the canvas, and then towards the middle. So I'm just going to try that and see. And I'm still initializing at 4, so we're default starting at scene 4. Let's set this back to 0, so we'll start at scene 0. And now here's the problem, is that because I have a really similar layer on top of a really similar image, I can't really tell which is which. So I'm going to comment out this background that's taking up the full canvas. And then we can kind of play with this a little bit more. Okay, that's looking pretty good. I think it's a little too low, so let's try this maybe more like 100. And I think that's looking good. And I think, again, I'd like to have this sort of float across the screen, much like a bird would be flying across our field of view. So again, I could use some variables here to set how this is moving. And in this case, I think I need a global variable. If I tried to set up a variable right here, right, so for instance, I could set a gull position. That would be getting reset every single time that we ran the draw loop. So I wouldn't get a fluid motion. I'd get maybe something more like that. And that is not the case down here where we're using the mouse controls, because P5 is already giving us a global variable in the form of mouse X. So it's done that work for us. So we need to do a little bit more legwork here. Not a big deal though, because that's pretty easy. We just need to come up here and let's make a gull position variable. So I'm declaring it here, and then I'll initialize it in setup. And I'm using this create vector object, and that way I can store both the horizontal and the vertical value of that position in one variable. So it just takes out a little bit of typing. So that's going to be its initial position. And then when I come down here to set it, I can just reference it with that dot syntax. So gull pos x, gull pos y. All right, so that's going to give us the same behavior. And then to make this move, whoops, and I'm moving it the wrong direction. So let's change that. So I'm using that line gull pos x minus minus. So every time the draw loop runs, we're subtracting 1 from the value of gull pos x. That's what's moving across the screen because we've made that relationship by plugging in gull pos x into that image function. And I think I'd like that to move a little bit faster. So I can use a slightly different notation here. The minus minus shorthand is always used for just subtracting 1. In this case, I'm going to set this to minus equals. Let's try 3. And that's the same as saying gull pos x equals gull pos x minus 3. And I think that's looking pretty good. Now, our challenge here is to get this to reset because, as you see, that layer flies across the screen and then it's just gone forever. So I can add a little conditional here to check if it's going off the left-hand side of the screen. And we'll say gull pos x equals width. Now look what's happening. When it hits the left-hand side of the screen, it's disappearing before it actually slides past that boundary. That's because the way that we're setting this image places it at the top left corner first, just like when we're using the rect function. So when that x value hits 0, the image is still actually on the screen. So I think we can just set this to slightly lower negative numbers. So let's try negative 20. And still, it's not quite getting there. So let's go back. I want to look at that file, and we can do this a little more precisely by figuring out the width of the file. So I'm right-clicking and going into Get Info. I can see this image has pixel dimensions of 48 by 94. So I want to say when gull pos x is less than negative 48, then reset it. And that should give it enough space to slide all the way across the screen. There we go. Cool, that's looking good. Let's uncomment out our background. So to me, the motion's looking good. I could maybe even add more of these if I wanted to. The one thing that I don't like, it's a little bit too frequent. So I want to give a pause from the time when the bird is sliding off the left-hand side of the screen until it's looping back to the other side. And I can do that by adjusting this line right here. So rather than setting it to the width, let's set it to a larger number. That gives us a bigger pause in between appearances of that motion. So maybe let's actually try width times 2. And that to me is looking much cooler. Okay, so I've got my state machine set up. I've got 6 different states. I've got some basic interactions, and to me this is a really interesting way, really engaging way to experience this composition in a different way, a way that's not really possible just looking at it two-dimensionally. And to me, I think this gives me some really good opportunities to sort of focus on things that I was thinking of as I created this and as I responded to the original prompt, which was the poetry assignment. Now, of course, you can use any composition you'd like, so you don't have to use your poetry example, but the same sort of requirements apply. You need to have 6 different states, maybe some basic interactions, and some sort of scheme for how to navigate from one state to another, whether that's linear or branching or random or a combination of any of those like you see here.